Jeffrey M. Smith is the best-selling author of Seeds of Deception and Genetic Roulette, a filmmaker and leading spokesperson on the health dangers of genetically modified foods. He's the founder of the Institute for Responsible Technology, and he's traveled to 45 countries over the last 22 years, exposing the devastating impacts of GMOs and Roundup and the ways in which the biotech industry has tried to cover up the evidence.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Smith. I'm with Dr. Mike McNeil, who's an agronomist in north central Iowa, who's been watching the impact of GMOs and Roundup on farming, both crops and animals, since it was introduced in the 1990s. I've known Mike for years and have learned a lot about glyphosate and GMOs and their effects on the farm and on crops and on animals and on the soil. Now, I wanted to introduce you, Mike, to our series because your insights are unique and they also give us value as to what may be happening inside of us so we get the full understanding of what we need to do to protect ourselves. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
So holistically, Mike, before we get drilled down into details and talk about manganese and formaldehyde in corn. Yes, I did say formaldehyde in corn. Before we get into those details, what would you say would be the observation holistically of what you've seen, for example, in livestock since GMOs and the GMOs sprayed with Roundup were introduced widespread in Iowa?
I think probably the biggest thing that I have seen is a reduction in the immune system of livestock and the ability to resist diseases. They just don't have the vigor that they used to have. We're seeing an increased amount of viral infections that seem to create considerable amount of death, and particularly in the young animals. We're seeing some reproductive issues that are pretty serious. So by and large, just a reduced herd health has been the biggest thing that I've noticed. The second biggest thing is a reduction in efficiency, and feed efficiency is taking more feed to get them to market. They're growing slower. The rate of gain is reduced. So not only are we, making them sick, but we're making them pretty inefficient, and that certainly takes the profit out of livestock production.
All right. So I'm going to say this one more time and then let people make the link themselves. When you hear about farm animals and you hear about their immunity and their reproductive issues and the lack of vigor, we can project that similar results may occur in human beings. And we also find that when people switch to non-GMO, their energy level goes up. They report less diseases and less colds and flus. And also some people report getting better from infertility. So we are seeing those type of things. Can you give us an example of, or maybe several examples of farms that you've worked with where the livestock had a specific disorder or disease that was shifted when you changed the operation to a non-GMO? And in this case, what's really interesting about farms is I remember I was at a medical clinic and I was interviewing individuals who had switched to a non-GMO diet and they were getting better from all sorts of things. But when they were switching to non-GMO, since it's not simply labeled, some were going organic, some were reducing processed foods, some were reducing gluten or dairy. But with livestock, you don't have gluten-free pigs or dairy-free cows. And so there is a built-in reduction of all the confounding factors when you just switch from GMO to non-GMO. So that gives us more confidence as to what's driving the bus off the cliff here. So tell us what you've seen specifically in farms and that you've been working with.
Well, just recently, I've been working with a grower that somewhat doubted that I was seeing this difference in glyphosate or Roundup treated corn versus non. And same way with the soybean meal that he's feeding his hogs. So we set up a study where we had two buildings side by side. When the pigs were brought into these barns, we divided them randomly. So as they came off the truck, there was no choice as to good or bad. They just randomly went into the buildings, and we put a couple thousand head in each barn. And we fed the one barn all non-GMO, non-glyphosated treated feedstocks, and we also watered them with water that had glyphosate removed from the water. So they were as glyphosate free as we could get them.
Nice, good job, excellent. Now now you got my attention, Mike.
Okay, so we set up, a really good scientific study. Bottom line, he made $10,000 per turn more on the non-glyphosate treated barn.
Now, when you say per turn, what does that mean to lay people who don't work in?
A group of pigs is in a barn for about a third of a year. So you'll get 3 turns per year.
I see.
So if he keeps doing that, he'll make $30,000 more on that one barn versus the other barn.
Now, what was causing him to make more money?
Well, that's the right question to ask.
So the pigs were gambling and they were smarter. Go ahead, what?
He had about a 20% death loss in a wean to finish. It's a wean to finish operation. He had about a 20% death loss in the one barn that had the glyphosate treated feeds. He had 1 pig die in the other barn.
Out of about 1 to 2,000.
Out of 2,000 pigs. He had 1 pig.
So on the one hand, 20% is 400 pigs.
That's right.
So 400 deaths on one side and a single pig on the other.
Correct.
That's pretty strong numbers
right there. But then we looked at rate of gain. He had a significant increased rate of gain. He had lower feed consumption. The pigs went to market 3 weeks sooner.
This is amazing. We need to get this information out to all the pig farms.
So we just finished that trial. So we're repeating it again to be sure that everything is as scientifically correct as we can get it. But it looks very, very promising. But we've done everything possible to completely remove glyphosate from the picture in the one barn. And the other barn is just the way we've been routinely feeding, using water from the well that we've always used, using GMO feeds that we know are treated with glyphosate.
Wow, this is amazing.
So that's one of the latest studies that I've just completed working with.
I am very impressed with that incredible number. So they went to market 3 weeks earlier, and is that a 90-day turn, or a 120-day turn? 120 with three per year.
120 some days, yes.
So it was 3 weeks earlier. So if you're getting $10,000 more per turn, and you're getting an extra 9 weeks a year, which would be half a turn, so you're actually.
I didn't even take that into account.
So now I'm just running the numbers in my mind. That's $35,000 more than, because you get 3 turns plus another extra half a turn if you're going to market sooner. That's pretty impressive. Now, is there anything, based on what you've seen, is there any drill down in terms of what's actually going on in these pigs that's different? You mentioned immune system. What was killing the other pigs? Maybe we can understand better.
I did another study where I compared corn, GMO corn treated with Roundup, and right across the fence, a non-GMO field that did not have any glyphosate applied or had not had for quite a few years. And as I looked at that, when we ran the chemical tests on it, we found 13 parts per million of glyphosate in the corn grain.
Now that actually is a lot. People have no idea what 13 parts per million are. But the FDA, recently there was an article that came out, it was in The Guardian and other places, where an FDA scientist, this was exposed to a Freedom of Information Act request. The FDA, it tests for all sorts of residues of pesticides on crops, but for some reason doesn't test glyphosate readily. And they were planning to do it, and then they stopped, and then they're planning to do it. There was this one researcher who was testing his own crackers and whatnot, and found cornmeal that was 6.5 parts per million, and that's the actual legal limit is 5 parts per million, and the FDA is supposed to report its findings to the EPA, but they said, oh, that wasn't an official sample, so they never told the EPA that the corn had higher levels. You turn out to have corn that's twice as high. Now it's feed corn, so it isn't necessarily aimed at eating directly by humans. It's not going to be made into corn on the cob, but it could be made into taco shells and things like that. So that's more than double, almost it's 2.5 times the allowable level. And that's pretty impressive. So what else did you find about the difference of this corn in the chemical analysis?
Well, one of the things that surprised me in a way was the amount of formaldehyde that I found in the grain. Formaldehyde is not a very good product to be eating.
And let's
unless you want to get prematurely preserved.
It's a preservative.
I found 200 parts per million of formaldehyde in the Roundup treated corn. I found 0 in the other corn.
All right, so the formaldehyde, it turns out, if you look at Monsanto's data, you look at the breakdown products of glyphosate, and formaldehyde is one of them. Right. And that is, it's stunning. There was also some research out of MIT that predicted higher levels of formaldehyde as a result of genetic engineering. There's also the possibility that the corn itself can break down into formaldehyde, and then its further breakdown product is stopped as a result of the glyphosate. But just the fact that even on Monsanto's website it says that glyphosate breaks down to formaldehyde should be, we can just stop there. And it turns out the amount of formaldehyde that turns a FEMA trailer into a health hazard is a tiny amount. And I'm guessing that the corn is much higher. I used to know the number.
0.003 parts per million.
For the FEMA trailer?
Yeah.
Oh my God, 200 parts per million in corn, and that's acceptable, and 0.003 parts per million in a trailer, and they're considered uninhabitable because of the breathing. Right. Now, formaldehyde is a poison. The World Health Organization's Cancer Committee determined that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen because they didn't have enough human studies. They had enough animal studies to say it definitely causes cancer in animals. It causes oxidative stress and mutations in DNA, so that could lead to cancer. And where it is sprayed in high amounts, there's higher levels of cancer. But it could only call it a class 2A carcinogen, not a definite carcinogen, but formaldehyde is a definite carcinogen. So there you go. You now have the glyphosate at 13 parts per million, and you have an even more potent carcinogen at 200 parts per million in the corn. So these are serious issues. What else did you find, Mike?
Well, I continued to analyze the corn to see if it had changed the quality of the corn at all. And so I started looking at the nutrients that would be available in the corn for the livestock to eat, thinking, if I see this reduction in feed efficiency, there must be a problem. And what I found phosphorus, which is very important in many of the metabolic pathways in our bodies. I found 3 parts per million of that in the glyphosate corn. I found 44 parts in the non-treated.
All right, so that's a significant difference between that and phosphorus, okay?
Potassium, which is very important in our bodies for many different metabolic pathways. I found 7 parts per million in the glyphosate treated. I found 113 parts per million in the non-treated.
Wow.
But one of the big ones is calcium.
Mm-hmm.
And, lack of calcium can cause osteoporosis in our bodies as we get older. It can be a really serious problem. I found 14 parts per million of calcium.
Mm-hmm.
In the non-treated corn, I found 6,130 parts per million.
In the treated corn. In the treated corn.
In the treated corn, there's 14 parts. In the non-treated corn, 6,130 parts per million.
This
a
is
lot of calcium there.
Now, I think what's happening in the corn plant, now you're the agronomist, so what I would understand is that you have the glyphosate chelation, you have the killing of the bacteria that normally turn the minerals into assimilable minerals, and the lack of translocation or transfer of minerals through the system. Is that what's happening?
Now, those are the three big things that reduce the amount of calcium in it, as well as all other metal cations. Magnesium, which is really important for our brain functions, short-term memory loss, early onset dementia, and those issues. There's 2 parts per million in the glyphosate treated, 113 parts in the non-treated.
Wow.
What
about manganese?
Manganese, which is really important for detoxification.
And sperm mobility or motility and immune system function and reproduction?
Right. 2 parts per million in the treated, 14 parts per million in the non-treated.
Now, it's very interesting that the impact on humans, if we look at that, is threefold, I'm guessing. And correct me, fill in here. We eat the GMO corn, so we're getting lower levels. We're eating the livestock who are eating the GM corn, getting lower levels. We're eating the glyphosate residues, which bind up our minerals, giving us lower levels of whatever we're getting. Now corn, like the pigs and the cows, they eat Roundup ready soy and corn primarily in North America, canola meal more in Canada, but also in the United States. And they're also getting heavy doses of glyphosate in their food. What are we seeing in terms of the minerals in the livestock? How does that translate?
Same. They're reduced. The meat contains less minerals. One of the scary things that I've seen, people say, well, I can eat bread because wheat is non-GMO and it's not sprayed with glyphosate. Wrong. They use glyphosate to desiccate the wheat, to dry it down just before harvest. So just before it's harvested, there's glyphosate sprayed on it, sprayed right on the kernel of wheat that's going to get ground up the next day and made into bread. So eating breads is going to give you a pretty big dose of glyphosate. The same is true with barley. So enjoy your next beer, get a nice good shot of glyphosate out of it.
Thank you for all of the beer drinkers that are now shaking their heads. Yeah. And wine, of course. Yeah.
But that is a big issue. And I did see a study that was conducted in New York City where they wanted to check people who had no exposure. In other words, they hadn't used it on their lawns. They were living in downtown city area with no exposure. Just a second, I'll pull that up on my computer. Let me get the exact numbers for you.
It's interesting. This follows up the study of urban dwellers in Europe who had glyphosate in their urine. And they don't eat a lot of GMOs as direct ingredients there. They do eat animal products that have been fed, animals have been fed genetically engineered feed. So we don't know exactly where the glyphosate's coming, whether it's in the food that they're eating in terms of animal products or they're just getting it otherwise. So what happened in New York?
Well, they examined the urine of 44 people. both male and female. And in the males, they found 10.3 parts per million of glyphosate. And in the females, 6.1.
Wow.
And they tried another group in a different area, 22 people, 16 males, or males had 16 parts per million, females had 2.7. So quite a large increase in the amount of glyphosate in male urine versus a female. And so they went back and said, okay, why? What's the difference? And what they discovered was those particular males that they had selected drank more beer than the females.
Wow.
And so they were getting it through the barley in the beer.
You know, that I would also like to know if the detoxification system is similar among men and women for glyphosate. You mentioned that manganese is important for detoxification, and if that's in short supply, then the liver may become less effective in detoxifying. There's a metabolic pathway called the P450 cytochrome pathway that helps the liver detoxify. Right. If that gets interfered with, as some scientists speculate, again, everything else that's toxic in the liver will be less easy to leave the body. There may be differences in the genders in terms of how well we detoxify. So one question I would have is it the inputs alone, or are women storing glyphosate more in the body? It's hard to say. I don't know if there's research, but it's a question.
I don't know if that's been studied. I do know that Moms Across America, Zen Honeycutt, has evaluated or looked at wine and found the same thing with various wines. Some
Right.
wines are a lot higher than others. So it really doesn't matter as long as that plant tissue is somehow ending up as getting ingested by our bodies. The glyphosate gets into us and causes all kinds of issues.
Now, one of the aspects of glyphosate is it's an antibiotic. Have you noticed any antibiotic properties or effects of GMOs and glyphosate in livestock?
I have seen more of a problem in soils, where there's been recommended rates of glyphosate applied for quite a few years. The soil is virtually dead. Very little microbial activity left in the soil. The pseudomonids are missing. The actinomycetes are missing. We're just suffering a great deal. What I found also interesting is that when many of these microbes are dramatically reduced, things like Fusarium, Phytophthora, and Pythium, which are pathogenic microorganisms, have increased at a rapid rate. And so we're seeing more diseases in plants. And as we see more diseases in the plants, we apply fungicides to control those diseases, which kill more fungi in the soil. And so we have an escalating problem, and it's escalating very rapidly.
So how serious is it? I mean, Iowa is a breadbasket state. It's known for delivering food, mostly hogs. After so many years, 22 years of planting GMO corn, what happens to a farm? What does it look like? How difficult is it to produce? How bad is it? And is this something that could affect the amount of food that we can produce as a nation?
Yes, it'll dramatically affect that. I worked with a 8,500 acre corn on corn producer that had been producing 200 bushel the acre corn pretty consistently. Saw his yields drop back to 100, 110, 120 bushel.
Per acre.
Cut in half almost. His soil was really hard. He could hardly till it anymore. He'd gone from like a 250 horsepower tractor to a 450 horsepower tractor to pull the same tillage tool. I checked the ground with a penetrometer, and I found it took more than 300 pounds of down pressure to push the penetrometer in 2 inches.
Wow.
A root will not penetrate the soil at 300 pounds of pressure. So that his plants just couldn't grow. They could not find, just like growing in concrete.
So now the thing is, was he still getting 120, even though 120
But
bushels
it
per
was going
acre?
down rapidly. He had one field that dropped to 70 bushel. And that's when I got called in and said, okay, can we fix this?
Wow. And were you able, I mean, can you turn around soil? Can you remediate after glyphosate? I know that that's a question that we're all wanting to know, not just for the fields, but for our bodies.
Yes, I was able to improve that. It took about 3 years to bring production back, but we're in that 190 bushel range now, so we're approaching where we were 5 years ago.
And do you
But
inoculate with biologics? Do you like, because we talk about building up the microbiome after it's been pummeled with glyphosate. Do you treat the soil in much the same way where you inoculate it with missing organisms?
first of all, you have to stop what was poisoning in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So no more glyphosate.
Right.
Uh, dramatically reduce any applications of fungicides, anything that will kill microbial life in the soil, we had to stop. Then we had to start feeding them because the glyphosate had chelated or tied up so many of the micronutrients, we had to start supplementing micronutrients. And I found that there was enough left in the soil that if you feed them, they would prosper. And they started coming back.
Okay.
In some cases, we got a little quicker comeback with the inoculation, but we always had to feed them.
And we talk about, in this series, we talk about prebiotics to feed the gut flora and the probiotics to add flora. So there may not be enough, or the diversity. Fascinating. So congratulations. And it gives a kind of a sigh of relief that in 3 years, we could take a farm which is on its way to being infertile and turning it around. And I understand that with the packed soil, you'll of course have less absorption of rain. Have you stood in front of a GMO field and a non-GMO field after a rain to see what they look like? Or do they look different?
Yes. The GMO fields that have had a lot of glyphosate applied will have very low infiltration rates of water. The water will be running off the field. You'll see streams and gullies forming. There'll be ponded areas in the field. And the field next to that has not had any glyphosate applied for many years, not a bit of water standing and no water leaving the field. So the erosion that we're talking about, the dead zones that we're seeing as a result of the runoff into the rivers and eventually into the Mississippi and then into the Gulf area, we're enhancing that dramatically with the use of glyphosate.
You know, I lived in Iowa for many years, and while I was there, there was the 500-year flood in Cedar Rapids, where the entire downtown was well underwater. And it was a disaster economically and for many, many people. Would you suppose that the compactified soil, due to the vast amount of Roundup ready fields, may have had an impact on the amount of water going into the flooded area?
It definitely does. It definitely does. I'm seeing that in the Des Moines River. I live next to the Des Moines River, and I've done so most of my life. And so it's flooding much more frequently now than it used to in the past.
This is really interesting. I mean, the knock-on effects from one to the other, some you can predict, some are just catch us by surprise. Don Huber told me about the botulism linked to glyphosate, the antibiotic aspect of glyphosate increasing botulism toxin, which is one of the most deadly toxins on the planet. Have you seen that?
I had a couple of experiences. One was pretty dramatic. I was in Maine visiting, talking with a group of farmers in Maine about glyphosate and some of the issues. And I had mentioned how it increases the Clostridium production in the gut of a cow, and can really reduce production and eventually kill the cow. And I showed some pictures of cattle that had died in Germany that was pretty dramatic. They get so thin. And after my presentation, one of the dairy farmers asked me if I could come out and look at his herd. And I got a little time. My plane doesn't leave until tomorrow, so I can come out this afternoon. Well, that'd be great. So I went out, and he took me into his barn, and very typical of a dairy farmer, he was very proud of his cows. We walked down the line looking at his cows, and they were beautiful. And I went by one that I could see had a Clostridium issue, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to offend him. And we looked at all of his cattle, and, well, what do you think? And I said, well, you have an extremely nice herd. They're really good looking cows, and they look very productive. But I said, you do have a problem. I saw 3 cows that I believe are pretty sick. Oh, what do you mean? And I said, well, let's take this cow right here. We're standing by. I said, this cow in the next few days, she isn't eating very well, I'm sure, right now. And in the next few days, all of a sudden, she's going to start eating quite good. You're going to come in the barn the next morning and find her laying dead. You should probably be foaming at the mouth and be laying there dead. He said, how do you know that? I said, well, I'm familiar with this pathogen and how it works. He said, that just happened a couple days ago. And I said, well, this is a problem for you. You need to be very careful, because you can also acquire this from just working with the cattle. And chronic botulism is going to cause, chronic fatigue. You're going to be really tired. It's going to be pretty hard on you. You're going to start losing weight. And he says, well, if you drink the milk, could you have a problem with that? I said, yes, you could. And he started to cry. Now, 2 grown men in a dairy barn by yourselves there, let's just say that's an awkward situation, okay? And I'm thinking he's feeling bad about losing his cows and maybe having to disperse his herd to clean this up. And he said, no, he says, my grandson is in the hospital. I forget, he said he's like 2 months old, something like that. And they said, we're afraid he's dying. We don't know what's wrong. And I said, well, I think, has he drank any of this milk? And he said, well, of course. And I said, well, you get in your car and you get to the hospital and ask them to screen for Clostridium botulinum, because they probably wouldn't think of doing that, because it's a registered agent or a biological agent in biological warfare. And so I would not think you can't do that. It's very difficult to do. But have to check that. Can you remember that? Yeah, I can remember it. I said, go. Don't stand here talking to me. And I left, and about a week later, I got a email from him. He said, I think you just saved my grandson's life. I have to tell you, it's pretty touching. I was like, really? And that's what they found. And I had another call, and on it, a similar thing, strictly on the phone, and I told them to check for that. They found it as well. And so it is It is possible to occur, and we're seeing more and more of it. And as I talked to him, he said, well, it can't be because this is an organic herd. And I feed all my own feedstocks. It just can't be. And I said, well, when I came into your barn, I noticed that you had some soybean meal there. It said all natural soybean meal. He said, yeah, they told me that that is fine for organic. And I said, well, I looked at the tag and it contains distiller's grain. I know of very few organic distillers. That distiller's grain probably came out of the Middle West. And if it did, it probably had concentrated amounts of glyphosate in that distiller's grain. And he checked it, and it did.
Wow. What an incredible investigative story. This is like, you know, those reality TV shows that you come in and you look at the autopsy or the crime scene, and thank you. I mean, wow.
Well, it was a very moving event for me. And so that really has inspired me to keep looking and just being alert to all kinds of things that are happening around us as a result of basically over application of a chemical to our environment.
So let's just explain to the audience why glyphosate would increase the botulism.
Okay, that's what comes into play is the antibiotic side of that.
Mm-hmm.
Kills off a bacteria that we have in our stomachs that keep the Clostridium botulinum that causes botulism under control. We all have a little bit of it in us. It's in the soil. It's everywhere around us. But that particular bacteria keeps it under control. It is easily killed by glyphosate. Once it's killed off, it allows the Clostridium botulinum to bloom, to multiply, to grow like crazy.
Wow.
And, there has been research studies done that show that. There's beyond a doubt that's what happens.
I've also looked at some studies where botulism was associated with sudden infant death syndrome.
I think that is and can be an issue as well. I think there are other issues that can also cause that problem that result from chelating or reducing, tying up minerals like magnesium or manganese that our bodies need. And when that baby is so low on that mineral, those metabolic pathways just shut down real quick.
Wow. So there's other reasons why glyphosate as a chelator might be related to sudden infant death, not just through the motion of Clostridium botulinum and the bot toxin that's produced.
That's correct.
Wow. Now,
it also can affect things like autism. We can see some issues as a result of too much glyphosate ingestion by the mother, and she could have an autistic child. And if you look at the data and the increasing rate of autism in our society, it's reaching an unbearable amount.
Yeah, I know. It's just incredible. So when you talk about let's talk about evidence here. And I know it's outside, you're an agronomist and you also look at livestock. Do you have any data points to support the link to autism? Obviously, there's a tight correlation between the rates of autism and the amount of glyphosate sprayed on GMO soy and corn. It's a breathtaking correlation. It's very, very tight. But correlation is not causation. It could be coincidence. Many people don't think it's a coincidence because glyphosate affects many of the physiological pathways and functions that are a problem with children on the spectrum. And in the film Secret Ingredients, we have a family that had an autistic boy. They went organic. The autism is no longer diagnosed. A second family, same thing. In my earlier, I was in Secret Ingredients, coming out this year. My last film, Genetic Roulette, 3 families with autistic children, all shifted to non-GMO and organic, all noticed an improvement. So there's anecdotal evidence. Do you have any additional information that you'd like to share?
Basically, there's more and more research being done on the impact of micronutrients on our brain function. And what I have shifted to is kind of back away from all of that, and I'm teaching people how to produce nutrient-dense foods.
Uh-huh. This is really interesting. Okay, now you have all the garbage. All right, go ahead.
Don't keep going down that path and, well, we got this and fix it with this, and just back clear away from that and concentrate on producing nutrient-dense foods. And we've set up a food hub in central Missouri where we've taught the growers how to produce nutrient-dense foods, and that food now is being distributed back out to the population, and it's being received very well.
So let me set this up here, because I want to ask you on behalf of the gardeners, as well as the farmers listening, but particularly the gardeners, because there'll be more of them on this series, what we can do. But to set that up, let's review for a second and realize that we have a situation where the minerals are so in such short supply with the GMO-fed crops, with the GMO-fed animals, with the amount of glyphosate, that all of these things that we're experiencing, all these different health dangers, health risks, and health conditions, many of them may be related to the lack of available minerals. And
right.
So one way to counter it is through supplementation, where you take pills, mineral pills. But what you're suggesting is that what we can do is we can build the mineralization, the nutrients, into the food that we're eating by growing our own food or buying it from a place that grows it in this way, so that we reverse it through our diet. So this can be a critical step for healing from GMOs and Roundup. So thank you for introducing us into this realm. Tell us what you do to make the food more nutritious and more nutrient dense, and how do you verify that?
Okay, what I start out with cleaning up the soil, making sure that there are no chemicals of any sort in that. I then apply generally animal manures that are coming from an organic production facility. If you just take regular animal manure, it's loaded with glyphosate.
Yeah, chicken manure, for example, I forget the parts per million, but it was pretty high.
Hog manure is also high, running like 4 or 5 parts per million, really nastily high. So what I generally use is cattle manure coming from grass-fed cattle that are not subject to any glyphosate-containing feeds.
And I want to insert one thing. I want to recommend an action step for everyone that likes grass-fed products. Contact the grass-fed producer and ask them if their grasses include genetically modified alfalfa. There is alfalfa out there that's genetically engineered to be sprayed with Roundup. It's a dumb idea, dangerous idea. And if they're not using Roundup Ready alfalfa, then they should brag about it on their package. So it's 100% grass-fed, fields not planted with genetically engineered alfalfa. If they start promoting that, and here's part where my activist hat gets put on, if they start promoting that, then the other ranchers that are thinking about doing 100% grass-fed are already doing it, realize, wait a minute, if it's a selling point not to use GMO alfalfa, then I won't plant it. So here, if we can get the grass-fed people, and by the way, if it says grass-fed, it isn't good enough. It should say 100% grass-fed or grass-fed, grass-finished, because you can do grass-fed and grain-finished. Grain-finished could be GMO grain. So when you speak to the grass-fed producers, is it 100% grass-fed? Is it grain-finished? Is the grass non-GMO? If it's non-GMO, urge them to brag about it on their label, not just for their own sake, but to help move the market so other people realize they can't afford to lose that market if they're going to be, and so they won't plant genetically modified alfalfa. Okay, coming back in, huh?
Very good point.
So coming back into your world, so you cleaned up the chemicals in the soil. You've put organic cow manure on there. What's next? And that, by the way, has a lot of the microbials. So the
now you're getting a lot of microbial life going. Then you check your soil health. See if you're short on any type of microbes that should be there. So you can send that into a lab. Woods Lab is a pretty good lab to check the microbial life in the soil. Make sure that that's pretty good. If that's up to speed, now you're ready to check the produce that you're producing. And send that into a lab and see what minerals are available.
So right now what you've done is, if this was a human, you've done the detoxification and a fecal transplant, and now you're doing the labs. Okay, go ahead.
That's right.
Yeah.
Check it out. And if it's right, you're going to see really high levels of those minerals. You say, well, that's a lot of expense and a lot of effort. Maybe a quick and dirty way of doing that is check the Brix level, B-R-I-X, which is the amount of sugar to production in the plant. And if you have a high Brix level, really high, all those other minerals are there as well.
So I've seen a refractometer it's kind of like if you have a garlic press. It's kind of like a garlic press. So explain how you would do a Brix test. It's fascinating, and it's so quick, and it's so easy.
Okay, it's a little tube with a glass lens in it, and in that lens there's some demarcations or lines. You squeeze some juice out of whatever material you're checking onto this glass. Then you hold it up to the light and look at it, and you'll see a light blue color and a dark blue color. And where that line changes, that's the number of Brix. And so you want it to be around 20, 23 Brix. And then you have a really good product.
You know, I can see the graduates of the Healing from GMOs taking their little squeezer into the produce section and creating little holes in the produce and squeezing it out. But this is actually something that is so easy, and I've known about this for years. There was talk years ago at an Acres USA conference about having a nutrient-dense certification. And I haven't seen it. Maybe it's out there. There's so many different certifications and verifications. But I feel like, to give you some insight into this world, organic is defined by what is not done. You don't use the prohibited synthetic chemicals. You don't use GMOs. You don't use sewage sludge. But it's not defined about what you do to increase the quality of the soil, et cetera. So you can have, so I always talk about organic as the choice in order to avoid GMOs and Roundup, and it is, unless you're making your own or you know your farmer and you know that it's prepared properly. But if once you've done that, and this group, you know, Healing from GMOs, okay, I've just switched to organic, what else can I do? What else to do is to even increase the quality of the organic. And
that's where I saw organic products that really didn't have the quality that I wanted. They were not nutrient dense. So I've gone to the nutrient dense, and when it's nutrient dense, there's really no other bad chemicals in it, because it just can't be nutrient dense if there are.
Now, you say 20 is good, but that's not with every single product. If you do corn on the cob, it'll be different than a kale. There's different than a cucumber. So can you download appropriate Brix level charts?
There are some sites that show the levels that you should try to achieve. And they'll show what's low, medium, and high. And you want to be high and higher to get nutrient dense. And a lot of times, just practice growing the materials yourself, and you'll find that you can grow better than anybody else. Now you've achieved nutrient dense.
You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to get a refractometer and go to a farmer's market and buy the same item in 3 or 4 stalls, in all the stalls, go in and check, figure out which is the best, buy my stuff from them, but also find out what they did. And then being an educator, I would tell the rest of the other vendors what I found out so that they could emulate at least for the next season. This is fascinating.
That's a good approach. And I think it's our next step to move away. We've sounded the alarm of the problem. We've made comparisons to prove the problem. Now, how do you fix it? Well, the big fix is to move to nutrient dense.
Fantastic. All right, so we've run the gamut of the changes in the livestock, the changes in the crops, the changes in the soil, and the overall and the threat to our even ability to produce food by those changes in the soil, reversing the soil, improving the crops, improving the animals, and now the humans with the nutrient dense, with that improved supply chain, with the kind of food hubs that you're creating. So this idea of the food hubs, it sounds from some people's standpoint as either a foodie thing to do or as an economically viable thing where you can get food less expensive by buying them directly from farmers. But really what we're talking about is an antidote to the negative impacts of industrial farming, in particular GMOs and Roundup, by creating food hubs. So I'd love to get any information you have to share in terms of documentation on a how-to that we can then send out to this list in the future for those that would like to either create a food hub or to invite people like yourself to create a food hub in their area so that maybe they don't have time to grow their own food, or whether they do or not, they want to share and bless their community with nutrient-dense food. And also, it's not just blessing the community in terms of their health. It's not just improving the quality of the soil, but it's sending monetary resources to those growers who are doing things right. And that is so important for our future. And it's like you have to feed those channels and they will live long and prosper. If we don't feed those channels, then we end up feeding the other monster, which is not such a healthy opportunity. Is there anything else, Mike, you want to share before we close up? Anything we've missed in terms of your experience with GMOs, with Roundup, with this whole improving nutrient dense?
I think we've hit the key points, and I would like to continue to pursue with you this nutrient dense production of food. I think that's what will help save mankind, and I'm pretty excited about it.
You know, a lot of people in this series have said, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And it's not just food in general. It's not just non-GMO. It's not just organic, but ultimately it's food that has been created from a system that has the nutrients in the soil, that has the health that's been cared for properly. Thank you for shedding light on this for all of us. I think you've just changed some people's lives.
All right. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Safe eating, everyone.
I enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.
We know our experts are sharing a lot of vital information with you. Don't worry about capturing it all. You can rewatch or re-listen as often as you want to, or share with your friends and family when you invest in one of our affordable educational packages. When you do, you'll receive the video and audio recordings and the transcripts, plus a list of each expert's recommendations to refer to. In addition, when you choose the Platinum Edition for just $97, you will also receive discounts of up to $350 to $750 on supplements, books, and programs offered by our speakers. Simply click the link below to learn more and to purchase.